So I think the only reason why I got invited is because I'm the one person who said that I don't care when I'm speaking, if I'm first or last or whenever. So, and of course what happens is then I was asked to speak first again. But the work that I'm talking about, and I apologize for those of you who were in 902, there's at least 2 or 3 of you, so you'll hear some of it for the second time. Apologies also to those of you who've seen the Crossroads talk that I gave at
You're just going to interrupt for a second, just so you know, we told, like you are recorded, and there's also live tweeting going on, so if people have their phone or their computer open, it's hopefully to communicate with a wider audience, not because you bore them.
All right. So that probably also means that I shouldn't swear or do anything that's not for public consumption, which I will not anyway. But so I do want to draw a little bit, at least at the beginning, on some of the things that I talked about at the Crossroads talk over at the Discovery Institute, and Laura Eisler is in the back, who is directing most of the efforts on public outreach and public engagement over there. Was nice enough to organize that and with the foresight to do that. But I want to quickly start out mapping the problem, and again, some of you know this, but what we know and what we don't know as Americans, and why that matters, because we actually know a lot more than I think our knee-jerk reaction as science communicators often give us credit for, when we're saying, oh, people don't know anything. That's technically not true. In fact, they know we all know what we're supposed to know. We just refuse to believe in it or to embrace it, and that's to a certain degree true in politics these days as well, when it comes to crowd sizes and other things. Why we live in tribes, why we live in groups that further that drive more of that divisiveness, both in science and in political science. We've shown that now again and again and again, and why that matters in particular for science. I put Galileo Galilei here, of course, as I mentioned in my undergrad class yesterday, because he's the perfect example of one of the first science communication problems, because of course he was never told by the Catholic Church that he was wrong, or that his science was wrong. In fact, the Jesuits and a whole bunch of other groups within the church knew that he was right. They basically said, don't talk about it, and don't make it public, which again, some of the parallels in the last few days you can already see. And then I want to end both with lessons for science communication, but also for our discipline, because I think our discipline, communication more broadly, is at an interesting intersection. So really quickly, this is data that some of you have seen, but just to illustrate how little we know. When I say we, I mean 325 million Americans. I don't mean people who watch Nova Science or read the New York Times. That's a very specific cross-section. Even people who go to science museums, that's a fairly narrow cross-section among people who have at least a college degree. About half of them, that go to the Science and Technology Museum at least once a year. That's among the most highly educated cohort in this country. Among people who don't have a high school degree or just have a high school degree, you have about 8% attendance. So 92%, 9 in 10 Americans who need it in many ways the most because they don't have the formal education to come with it, never go to a Science and Technology Museum. And so you see that all the problems that come with that, right, in terms of levels, in terms of gaps across already existing educational gaps, and so on. So we ask in national surveys, do you think that it's true or false that the Obama administration recently banned all synthetic biology research, which of course is not true, which about a third of Americans know. The majority, though, either admits that they don't know, they don't have the slightest clue about the policy, or they even get it wrong. So you have about two-thirds of Americans who either don't know about a fairly influential technology and what the policy environment surrounding that is. And of course, there's often this knee-jerk reaction that America has unique sets of problems because we don't pay attention to science, because we don't have the right media infrastructure, because we have declining public infrastructure. So the question is, are we different from other countries? And again, I know I've showed this in 902 for sure. The breakdowns, these are not my breakdowns. I always joke about anybody who puts Europe together, and since we have somebody from Lithuania here, somebody from France, somebody from Germany, about as different as they can be. So Europe is not one homogeneous group, but for the sake of these data, asking basically public buy-in to evolution. Right? And we've known for a while that the US is not necessarily very high on that list. John Miller and others in 2006 showed that we're second to last, just ahead of Turkey on a list of developed countries. Same thing, these data, not any different. The US weirdly sticks out. We invest a whole bunch of money in science, a large chunk of our GDP, but for some reason we don't buy into this. So when I ask you, do you agree or think that's true, the US is significantly low. So what is it about the US? And this is actually where the part comes in what I said earlier. It's not just what we know, it's what we actually do know and or know we're supposed to know but refuse to know. And so if you break these data down differently and you ask them in different ways, and a lot of people have written about this, but basically the unique nature of public opinion in the US. Same question again on the left and with the exact same results, but now what they do is this is basically a survey that does a split, this is the so-called split ballot. So everybody, whatever 1,200 people, are in the survey, and then get the same survey, then they get randomly assigned to one of two conditions, either this wording or this wording. The only thing that this wording adds is according to the theory of evolution. So basically it says, scientists say this is true. So for the first one, is this true, do you agree? 40%. For the second one, all of a sudden we're exactly where you saw earlier China, Japan, and Europe is. So when I ask the public, do they think that scientists think that's true, they know that scientists think that's true. It's not that they don't know, it's just that they refuse to embrace that view for themselves. Same thing for the Big Bang, we have almost the exact same numbers, where again we see that weird split between, I totally know that astronomers say this, but no, I don't believe it. Right? So that's that interesting split that already gets us toward this idea why social groups, and explains to some degree why we're having a country where a good chunk of people believe, and including some people in the new administration, that climate change is a hoax and has been thought up either by the Democrats in order to push regulations or by the Chinese for other reasons. Or you have people who think that climate change is real and is a real threat. How have we managed to create, within the same country, two separate realities? And one explanation, of course, is and one of the key explanations that I want to talk about today is values. And the idea that our values shape not just who we are, but how we think. And not just how we think, but how we process new information. And just to give you an illustration, this is data from the World Value Survey at Michigan. Braun Engelhardt and others collect this, asking one question: how much guidance does religion provide, does God provide in your life? On a 1 through 10 scale, or a 0 to 10 scale, if you include atheists as 0. UK, France, Germany, US, obviously out of scale, but just to give you a sense, and if you want to guess in your head right now where those countries are on a 10-point scale, England basically around a 5, the UK rather, excuse me, and then France, and then Germany, especially after the reunification with a bunch of atheists, 20 million of them joining the West Germany, even lower. So that's where you roughly have Europe. And that's why you don't have those weird gaps that we see in the US between public opinion on the topic and public opinion about what scientists think. In the US, and I put Rick Santorum there, put anybody else there, this is the average from New York State to California to Montana to Hawaii to wherever. On average, Americans score an 8.4, 8.5 on that 10-point scale. So we're a deeply, deeply religious country. A country where religious values matter tremendously, right? And where religious values matter for a whole bunch of scientific topics, from embryonic stem cell research to nanotechnology, as I will show you later, to human gene editing and so on. And that's where a lot of these issues come in when it, and I keep walking out of the picture, I think, I'll just wave you back and then you'll have to adjust the camera. But a lot of the issues come in with how we self-sort in this country. And some of it is based on technology, and I'll get to it, and some of it is based on values, and I'll get to that, but some of it is simply based on human nature and the idea of homophily. Sociology concept, really old, the whole idea that birds of a feather flock together, right? We all do it. We all have friends on Facebook that are more like us than the rest of the population. We hang out with friends that are in terms of race, income, education, more like us than anything else. We live in neighborhoods that are more like us. you're a grad student, you're going to end up somewhere in Willie Street. At least there's a higher likelihood of you ending up there. If you're a faculty member, you're on the near west side, and so on and so forth. And even in a place like Madison, that already is pretty homogeneous, even there we self-sort further. So basically the idea of homophily means we end up talking, living with, interacting with people that are just like us. The tricky part with that is that as a result we hear basically mostly what we're already believing. And you know, during the Walker recall elections, for instance, my neighborhood was just full of recall Walker signs, right? There's absolutely nothing else. You drive outside of Madison, Ithaca, New York, where I was before, exactly the same thing. You're within Ithaca, everybody votes Democrat, you go outside, and the state turns pretty Republican pretty quickly. And it's just a matter of self-sorting. It's not that one is right, the other one is wrong, it's just a matter of self-sorting. The problem is, my neighbors think exactly like me. If I have conversations with my neighbors, I learn nothing new. I don't get my viewpoints challenged. I don't get that deeply democratic idea that look, I hear other views, I argue back and forth, and eventually we both come to the best, or all of us come to the best possible decision, right? This is the Federalist Papers, this is the beginning of this country. Homophily says, yeah, no, not so much. It's basically, I talk about myself, convince myself, talk about amongst my group of people, convince myself that Hillary Clinton is going to win the election and be really surprised that there's a good chunk of the country that doesn't think so. That's classic homophily. So part of it is just human nature, and the illustration, and I showed this before in 902, just to illustrate, even in a heterogeneous place like New York City or Manhattan in this case, where all the hipsters are sitting, right? This is just Yelp reviews on where the hipsters are sitting left and right of the Williamsburg Bridge, and basically over in Brooklyn, and then maybe on the way home from work, you know, they have their whatever hipsters do. I have no idea. Clearly I'm not one. Kosher, I'm not cool enough to be one. Kosher, which is the other one, you go to the theater district, upper west side, and east rather, and you'll east and west, and you'll already see kind of how people cluster. And I showed this exact same one before because the hangovers are the only thing that bring us all together, which I still find somewhat soothing and comforting. But the second thing, as I said, there's aside from our human tendency, we're now living in an environment, and when I say now, this whole thing about fake news that has produced an outrage over the last 2 weeks is ridiculous, right? Because fake news is not new. Fake news has always existed. Fake news has always existed at the supermarket checkout counter in the National Enquirer. Was always there, and there was always weird websites. And 2 elections ago, we showed that 7 out of 10 Americans were convinced that Sarah Palin said, "I can see Russia from my house," which of course she never did. There was a clip on Saturday Night Live, but 7 out of 10 Americans were convinced that was Sarah Palin. Right, so this has always existed. This is not a new problem. The problem that we're having is that it travels much more quickly, and we have an ability to sort ourselves much more quickly into certain diets of news. And even that is not a new problem. Rachel Maddow, who of course continues to be a strong voice on the ultra-left, and basically spoke about this is now 7-8 years ago. And she basically then already identified her view of where cable had gone. And cable a long time ago went exactly that direction. The holy grail of marketing has nothing to do with having broad segments, you know, saying, oh, I'm going to go after 18 through 25-year-olds. That's already pretty broad. The holy grail of marketing is micro-targeting to a point where I get exactly the audience that I want. This is why we have home decorating channels. This is why we have 50,000 cooking shows. This is why we have a fishing channel and whatever else, and 4 different local sports channels. Because it makes fiscal sense to not reach a mass audience the way we used to do it, but basically reach an extremely homogeneous, narrow audience, and that audience I can sell better advertising for than anything else. David Letterman used to be the best example for that, because he basically had 1 million viewers, all in the same kind of male, unattached, had time to watch TV, midnight Eastern, and could spend that money. So he sold advertising, and even having 1 million was good enough. Rachel Maddow, Hannity, all these places basically pushed us one step further politically and said, if I can find an audience politically that eats this stuff up, either on the left or on the right, I have a perfect business model. What is she saying here? She's basically saying in a talk, hey, you guys, CBS, ABC, all of you who are losing money at New York Times. That's kind of funny because we're making all the money right now. Opinion-driven media make all the money that traditional neutral media is losing. And the moment in that talk that she gave at Harvard in whenever that was, I put her own quote in there. Oh, that's pretty vain, but that's where we cite her. But she gave that talk, I think, at Harvard in, I want to say 2006-07, and basically said, look, every time I go crazy on, at the time, Bush, my ratings go up. And Sean Hannity, of course, exactly the same, right? Every time he goes crazy on Michelle and Barack Obama, his ratings go up. So this is not a new phenomenon. It's just one that that the idea going from broadcasting, so taking a message on CBS, ABC, and we broadcast it to 320 million Americans, is now going to narrowcasting. We just, when we rolled out the Science of Science Communication report last week, a person from the Washington Post, Laura, and I'm totally blanking on her last name, she would kill me for that, but basically talked about A/B testing on social media. The Washington Post does it, everybody else does it. You go live with a story, 2 headlines. They go live at the same time. Same story, 2 headlines. You go to the Washington Post website, you see it on Facebook, you get a random assignment of a headline. And then within 5 minutes, I know how fast that headline is traveling. Are you liking it? Are you sharing it? Are you passing it on? And then after 5 minutes, I pull the one that doesn't work and go with the one that does work. So the idea that we're using algorithms for editorial choices, right? What used to be written by an editor, what used to be decided by a human being based on what maybe necessary news are that we all should see based on editorial decisions, is now really driven by metrics. And you can see the problem, right? You can hopefully see where that is. Popular taste might be great, but popular taste gave us Britney Spears and the return of the 80s. So it may not always be the best thing to drive news coverage. But that's one development. And the other development, of course, the most successful distribution platforms right now that we're having are driven basically by keeping you in an environment that makes you comfortable. The business model for Facebook is to keep you there as long as possible. And I'm repeating something that you've read 1,000 times, but it matters. We are all not the customers of Facebook. We're the product that's being sold, right? We go there, we fit a whole bunch of information that's basically your registration card that you fill out for any product. That's what your Facebook profile is, right? This is what I really like, this is who I like, this is the pictures that I'm tagging, and hey, here's a bunch of behavioral indicators of what I do, meaning I follow all these people, I look at their posts. And the idea is I will now target you if I'm Facebook with exactly what you want. That's the point. That's the business model. And the longer you stay, the more money I make. And the sooner you go, meaning I piss you off with something that you don't want to read, I've just lost money. So the most successful business models right now in media distribution and content distribution is basically based on us staying in an environment that makes me comfortable. If I'm a Democrat, please give me yet another story about why I shouldn't have lost this election. If I'm a Republican, please give me yet another story why Hillary Clinton should be in prison. Because that makes me feel really good. And then ideally feed me a bunch of other comments from other people that reinforce it. So why does this matter? Because it produces this, right? Which is if you're Hamilton, if you're Washington, you just want to shoot yourself in the head if you weren't dead already, because it's the opposite of American democracy, of what American democracy should be like. It should be us getting together, exchanging ideas, me hearing things that I passionately disagree with, and then working through that, maybe being convinced, maybe not being convinced. But what's happening is this, basically. There's just a map of blogs, political blogs. All the blue ones talk to each other, all the red ones talk to each other. So there's the Drudge Reports here, there's the Huffington Posts here, and they link very little, right? And you've seen this. If you're on the left, you get all your Raw Story and whatever else over here, and if you're on the right, you get all your Breitbart, Drudge, and whatever else. And they even link to each other, and that's exactly where we end up. And as a result, a whole bunch of people were really surprised about what discourse was happening on the right, and vice versa, what was happening on the left. So why does this matter for science? Really quickly, it matters for science, of course, because we can realistically probably sit here and say, hey, when it comes to abortion, do we care? That is an opinion-driven thing, right? I mean, you can say that's a human rights issue, and that's one way of looking at it. You can say that's a religious issue. It's another way of looking at it. But ultimately, it's a political question. It's one where you can reasonably have different viewpoints. For science, at least for scientific facts, and I think the other aspects of science, whether it's an open question, but for scientific facts, there shouldn't be that debate about if they're right or wrong, because we have established science as the best way of at least finding out, if not knowing. But for science, and this is slightly updated from the data that I showed at Crossroads, the polarization data in the US. This is where we started in 1994. Newt Gingrich introduces the Republican Revolution in Congress, right? This is basically 2 years after Bill Clinton, historical, as always, midterms right after the president gets elected, backlash in the House and in the Senate. It's exactly what happened. Newt Gingrich comes in and a whole bunch of people with ultra-conservative agendas, explicitly so, they wouldn't mind that characterization. Even then, the normal curves of Democrats and Republicans where they place themselves is still pretty close together. You can still win if you're Bill Clinton in 1996 re-election, or if you're Bob Dole, who tried to challenge him in the middle of the normal curve. 2004, Bush 43 has started a bunch of wars that are deeply unpopular. He has ridiculously low approval ratings, still higher than Trump's at the moment, but ridiculously low approval ratings, and basically runs a re-election campaign in 2004 that says, hey, people in Florida, Ohio, 9 million of you, turn out and elect me because there's a culture war going on. He basically says, screw Democrats, I'm going to turn out more Republicans on the ultra-conservative side. Even then, we still have a middle of the road kind of group that you can campaign to and that you can find consensus solutions around. This is 2015. And here's your campaign, and here's your problem of running a traditional campaign in 2016, and that is that you basically have the Democrats here and you have the Republicans here, and you have very few in the middle that you can actually target as far as you know, the centrist kind of campaigns that if you like George Bush 43 or not, but it was a centrist campaign that he ran in 2000, same thing for Clinton and same thing to some degree for Barack Obama. That's becoming more and more difficult, and it makes total sense that you can pick up votes either here or here, and that's exactly what we saw, right? We saw Bernie Sanders doing really well here, and we saw Donald Trump doing really well here, and we saw all establishment candidates basically dying either in the primaries here, well, here and then here, or eventually in the general. But here's our problem for science. These are the same audiences that we're dealing with when we talk about highly controversial science. And it basically does a few things. Number one is it shapes our behaviors. And I just want to illustrate that for something that all of you have hopefully seen, but just as a reminder, because this experiment is one that's beautiful for a variety of reasons. Obviously, the Solomon Asch experiments on conformity. This was really driven by Nazi Germany and rise of fascism, and fascism sticking around in Europe and Spain and elsewhere. But what they wanted to know is what makes people give in to public pressure, to their social environment. The beauty of this experiment is it's, again, not about opinions. It's not like me walking in here and realizing everybody's a Republican, and then I'm being a bit less expressive in my democratic views, for instance. That's an opinion. This one is about facts, meaning which line of these matches up with this. And it's an obvious fact. It's a fact that everybody in this room will have the correct answer to. It doesn't require expertise or anything. So the beautiful part for this is that basically what they ended up doing is they had all of these Confederates here, right? The only person who is actually an experimental subject is this person. Everybody else is a Confederate. So they go around the room and all these people give the wrong answer. They don't pick B as the correct line. And every time I present this, I need to double check from the angle that this is actually the correct line. But so basically then this person sits there and you can already see his facial expression because he's completely freaked out because the group is going against him. His tribe is going against him, right? So this is where you see his face a little bit more. And basically, when they asked afterwards, so what actually happened? Why did, in the majority of the cases, and you saw the number 7 out of 10, why did you go with the majority rather than with what you knew was the right answer? Think science, right? I know what the correct answer is. I just refuse to know it. This is what I showed you earlier. And the answer is psychology. It's basically this is how strong group psychology is. And this is the same reason, right, why we're wearing ties, why fashion works, why we do certain things even though we think, and I was joking earlier about the return of the 80s, right? Nobody should wear mirrored aviators. Nobody ever should have. But it most certainly shouldn't have come back. But it still did. And the answer is why, right? So why is everybody wearing gazelles now, Adidas again? Because, of course, they're coming back. And so this is it. And it's totally fine for Adidas shoes, especially they're German products. But it's much less funny for science. And the open-ended comments also said they know they were wrong. I don't care as much about being right. Science, it's much more important to feel part of something. And I think this is 1960s, 70s work, and I think we fail to appreciate how important that is for science. Now, I know I mentioned this in 902, but there are positive outcomes of this. And Obama, of course, the Obama administration has had a whole psychology task force on nudging, for instance. How do we get to people do things that they don't want to do? All of us, of course, right? So you stand there and it's like, you're going to walk over to recycling, you're going to toss it in the trash right there. And what they did is they used these hang tags. This is work that Robert Cialdini is the lead author really there in this, did with hotels. And for those of you who've seen this, I apologize, but for those of you who haven't, it's actually a really fascinating study because they went into hotels and basically changed this hang tag that says, hey, by the way, recycle your towels. Don't just leave them on the floor, but if you put them back, then we're actually not going to wash them. Either you can be really nice to nature. That's one possibility, and I hope I did these one by one, yes, and so that means about a third of the people find that message credible. Or I tell you, hey, by the way, all of this, but then I also tell you, and on top of that, 3 out of 4 people in general recycle. So I'm trying to get that group of, and these were all white males in that 1970 study, but I'm trying to get that mental image like other people don't do this. And all of a sudden that goes up to 44%. Right? And now I'm trying to get the social pressure really to hit home, and I say, in this room, I'm putting the room number on this, let's do in 215. In 215, 3 out of 4 people do this. And all of a sudden I go to half of them. Right? So this public pressure actually had, in terms of nudging, in terms of getting us to do certain things that we don't want to do is really important. Now, the one flag that I would put on, the one rider that I put on here is, think about the ethics of nudging. I'm basically lying to people. I'm telling them 75% do something when in reality 35 do something, and even after nudging, half do it. So you already see the problem. So am I really lying to you for a greater social good? And the answer is yes, I am. Should I? That's a different question. But one way or the other, you see the mechanisms. The problem is that the group and the tribe that we're in, that we're part of, also influences how we use information and how we process it. The first one is work that we did with, Dominique here, Mike Zenos, and a bunch of other people, and where we basically give people information. We had 2 large centers for nanotech and society here at NSEC with engineering and a CNS. So the NSEC is a nanoscale engineering center, which was kind of an engineering part with a social science component. And then we had a large center for nanotech and society, which was one of the first centers that the NSF funded just to deal with the societal impacts. It's a $13 million center with Arizona State and Georgia Tech. As part of that center, we did a whole bunch of work on how do people react to news in these new environments. So a blog post from the Ottawa Citizen trying to basically take out the political loading, so neutral Canadian source. But then we said, hey, before you move on, look at some of these additional pieces of information. It's completely irrelevant what's on here. It's basically about nanosilver. So nano-sized silver particles that help with certain kinds of products, but also potentially contaminate water supplies and do other things. The important part was that each piece of information got a cue, an ideological cue. MSNBC, so it's Rachel Maddow on the left, or her station. Then you have Fox News, which is Sean Hannity and so on, right? You get the political loading, and then you have the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in the middle as a neutral source. Those were randomized, those were randomized. So people just got basically a random selection of each in front of them. What we wanted to know is, do they go based on the information, meaning I want to find out more about a topic that's not politically charged? It is not. Or are they going to simply, if they don't know something, are all of us more likely to go by ideology? And given the setup and given the last 30 minutes of what I talked about, you can kind of see where the results are going. This was multi-waves, like getting closer to the election. And the closer we got to the election, the more we assumed people would use partisan cues, obviously. So this is only the first wave, meaning far away from the election, where they shouldn't use partisan cues yet. Even there, liberal, conservative, do your first click that you make, basically we allowed them in this information environment to pick one, then that was blanked out, then they could pick another one, so they could kind of go for more and more sources. You could technically only pick liberal sources. This one is just the first click that they made. This is MSNBC. If you're conservative, you're very unlikely to pick conservatives. If you're liberal, MSNBC, if you're liberal, you're extremely likely. And the other way, Fox News. So here's the depressing part about this, right? This is a scientific issue that's not stem cell or anything that's religiously or ideologically charged. This is fairly neutral. This is something that people know very little about. It's a blank slate. It's not that they already know what Newt Gingrich or Trump or Hillary Clinton or Obama is telling them about these things. There's very little. Even then, what do? We basically sort into certain types of information. And it doesn't matter what the information is, it simply matters where it comes from. That's the depressing part. But it's not, I'm not there yet as far as really depressing. So, and that's the next part of this. Once that information reaches us, so this is just about us seeking that information. But what happens once we reach it? And this is what motivated reasoning is all about. And all of you have read about this at some point. At least you've read about this part, the confirmation biases. Because it was in New York Magazine, it was in the New Yorker, it was in Atlantic, it was absolutely everywhere. We've known about this in political psychology since the 80s. Meaning, we knew that if I put the same piece of information in front of a Democrat and a Republican, then they will look at it differently. They will process that information differently, or motivatedly reason their way through that. What motivated reasoning really is, it basically says, I put, let's say, 10 pieces, any number, of information in front of you, 10 cards, let's very, very graphically, 10 cards with information in front of you. All of us will weigh more heavily those facts that fit our prior beliefs. So if I think that you know, I don't know, Donald Trump won the election, then I will reason my way through all these facts and these pictures that I'm looking at. I'm like, well, that white in the back, this is just because the Park Service, this time they actually put stuff over the grass, right, so you could see the empty spaces more easily. So that picture really doesn't show that he didn't have as many attendees, which is technically correct, right? There's cover that wasn't there last time around. But at the same time, that's clearly motivated reasoning. And so what ends up happening, it's not that I ignore the facts, it's that I'm basically tweaking and adjusting the facts. And this is what confirmation and disconfirmation biases mean, and also then biased assimilation. I basically take new information and I assimilate it into my existing belief system in ways that don't threaten my belief system. It's not a conservative problem, it's not a liberal problem, it's all of our problems. We just do it. But of course it means that for science, and this is where the kicker comes in, right? This is again for abortion that may make some sense because it's an opinion issue or an attitudinal issue. For science, that does become a problem. That the fact that the same science means different things to different people, and that's a real problem because it shouldn't. Right? It violates that assumption. The one example that I picked, there are multiple stem cell that works exceptionally well, but I used the one from biofuels simply because I think it hammers home the point for UW-Madison. Because when Walker cut funding for UW's system, he of course also cut some matching funds for biofuels research that had been part of Great Lakes Bioenergy and other things. And everybody at the university, or a lot of people at the university, said, how does he not get the economic impacts of this? How do conservatives not get how important this is economically? Well, we actually had a study that we had done with a corn growers association, actually. So this is a Wisconsin sample where we looked at what's their information intake, how many more cards do they get in front of them, right? They have a lot of cards in front of them, motivated reasoning, or few. Well, the more cards I put in front of them, what happens? Democrats, Republicans, do they see more or fewer economic benefits? This is the zero line, positive, economic, negative. So this is where Democrats are. With a few cards, the more cards they get, the more excited they get about the economy and the economic impact. Republicans actually start out at a very similar point, but the more information they get, the further they move apart. This group is not right, this group is not right. It's simply that they both use their priors and basically then reason and assimilatedly, I'm not going to get the adverb right, biased, assimilating, whatever they do, basically take the information and assimilate it into their system in a biased fashion and end up even further apart. So the more information I feed them, and they feed all of us, the more motivated reasoning kicks in, the more polarized we end up getting. Answering a whole point of, or explaining a whole number of phenomena that we saw, these red and blue normal curves that moved apart, why people know what they're supposed to know but refuse to know it, and so on and so forth. So it's this key idea of motivated reasoning. A study that I wish I had done, and just to illustrate that point and the dangers behind this even more, this is Brendan Nyhan, who is a faculty member at Dartmouth in political science, did a study in pediatrics where he basically took parents who either really wanted to vaccinate their children, were kind of on the fence, or really didn't want to vaccinate their children, and gave them different kinds of interventions. And I just blocking these out because this is what I want you to look at, and basically only these two, and I know I showed these in 902. So they gave them a narrative condition, they gave them images of what can happen, they gave them a risk, kind of only focusing on risks. These are the two important ones. This is the control condition, meaning nothing was done to these people. This is the correction condition, where you basically go in and put more cards in front of people, where you basically present them with all the facts why they're wrong. And the key one, of course, is this, right? So this, I'm going in, and here's these parents, and I tell them here are all the scientific reasons why you're wrong. Motivated reasoning. What do they do with every fact? They basically reframe it and reprocess it and assimilate it in a biased fashion to the belief system. Even with error bars, these two error bars, this group is doing significantly less well or worse than the control group. Meaning, if I hadn't talked to these parents at all, they would be more likely to vaccinate their children. Now I've gone in and actually done this whole intervention based on facts, and they're even less likely to vaccinate their children. So bad communication that doesn't take these new realities in this brave new world and into account will actually produce outcomes that are significantly worse than if we hadn't done anything. Which is hard for me to say as somebody who works in science communication, but bad science communication is actually worse than not communicating at all. So let me end on three things, and hopefully we got plenty of time, or at least some time to talk. A, what do we do about it? And of course the answers are all over the place. This is a bunch of Italians who are saying, well, what we need is the opposite algorithm, right? We need basically the anti-Google algorithm. Google feeds us, and so does Facebook, what we want. This is an algorithm that figures out what we want and it gives us the opposite. So you're looking for something that tells you one more time that things are going to be all right and the Democrats are going to win again in 2018. This one is going to tell you the opposite, and it's going to feed you something from Breitbart. Or vice versa. You think Trump is the greatest thing ever, it'll feed you a bunch of articles from MSNBC. Cute idea, great, but it's never going to happen because commercially it makes no sense. Right? It's just not going to get implemented, and maybe some of us are going to use it, and even we are not going to use it for very long because, I mean, let's be honest. So what are some of the alternatives? Well, let's do human curation, right? Let's actually roll back some of the algorithm stuff, which Facebook, of course, did, and then with the people who curated their newsfeed, and then that came out, these people, after they got laid off, said, hey, by the way, we routinely picked Democratic over Republican news, and fed that into people's newsfeed. So that didn't work out so well. And then they got rid of all human curation, and then the next thing that happened after that is that all the fake news trended on Facebook all the time, because of course there was no more human curation after they got rid of their editor. So far every solution that we've actually engaged in hasn't worked, and then BuzzFeed, there's some irony in BuzzFeed breaking that news story after the election, but basically saying that for the whole election, viral fake news outperformed real news on Facebook by far. And that goes again in both directions, politically. But so clearly everything that we've tried to do so far hasn't worked. And then now we're trying to do some fact checking and again some mix. But the problem is none of these things are commercially viable necessarily. So unless we actually start rethinking how we fund these things, we're going to have a real problem. And that's one angle. The second angle, though, is us. How can we get people to not engage in motivated reasoning, or to at least make an effort to do that less? And there's some research, Phil Tetlock at Penn, others have argued, Mike Roloff at Northwestern have argued, that the moment we feel some social accountability, so the same thing that makes me give in to public pressure, I can also use to make you think more. Not you, us, all of us. And they call it social accountability, right? So what happens if I know I have a room of non-like-minded others? What happens if I have to give a talk to the Republican caucus in the State House and I'm a liberal, or to a Democratic White House and I'm a conservative? Well, I engage in cognitive tuning. And that's Mike Roloff's term at Northwestern in communication. What he means by that is, I anticipate disagreement, and as a result, I use information preemptively more carefully. So I basically will read information and process it more carefully if I know that I routinely don't have homophily, if I know that I routinely don't find homogeneous groups. So that's in heterogeneous settings. You already see the problem that's, unfortunately for most of us, we don't routinely have those interactions. But we tested experimentally what happens if we do force people into these conditions. This is undergrads at Wisconsin and Louisiana State. So basically we had 4 conditions. People were in an experiment, they got a bunch of information, and then we told them in each condition something slightly different. This group was told nothing. We told them experiment is over, goodbye. These people were told you have to talk to others that think like you. We're going to assign you to a discussion group, and you're going to, people with similar views, and you get to talk about it more. These people were told you're going to talk to others, and we just left those others undefined. These people were told that they had to talk to people that they disagreed with. So that condition that creates cognitive tuning. And then we gave them a gated news environment, a bunch of articles that they couldn't get out of. They could click around and open some. They were in 3 categories: general news, science news, and then editorials and opinion pieces that hit both sides. So the opposite of biased assimilation, right? Basically I will have to read about both sides of the issue. And then we looked again, where do they go first? In that gated news environment, in these 4 conditions, and these are the numbers that are important. Compare the averages in here to the no discussion condition. And you already see that every single one of these numbers is almost twice as high as this number, at least almost twice as high as this number. Meaning, the moment I make you talk, and they didn't talk, they only thought they had to, right? That's the only thing that happened in their head. None of them were in a discussion group. The moment you think you have to talk to others, you start reading information more carefully. You start preparing in an anticipatory fashion. But by far the largest number, 40%, is the one in the opposing views condition. So those are basically the ones who know they're going to have to talk to people that are not like them. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, probably should catch up on what the other side is thinking, because I don't want to look like a complete idiot in the process. So as a proof of concept, that basically says, look, we can actually create these conditions, and we can create the potential benefits from that. But let me talk about 3 things. I'm getting late. Why these things, what these things matter. And I just had a conversation with somebody from the informal science education environment, or from CASE, a project out at TL at Washington, about this. What are the new citizen competencies that we need? Because it's not the fake news environment that exists because it has existed for a long time. But I think what we need are some new competencies that allow us, and this may be K through 12 or K through 16 or continuing learning competencies. But how do we extract information from this environment? Right? How do we actually distinguish on Facebook and elsewhere what some of these sources are? Because they're not that difficult to distinguish. If you need Facebook to flag fake news for you, you have a larger problem. And so these are competencies, citizen competency problems. And I don't mean to belittle that, because I do think it's a matter of competencies. The second thing is, how do we debate these issues with one another? We actually don't talk to one another very much anymore. I mean, if you follow any comment thread on Twitter or anywhere, it's basically, maybe there's 2 healthy exchanges and it immediately goes conversational bombs and people calling each other libtards or whatever else, right? I mean, it goes pretty quickly out of control on both sides. And then, of course, I think it's an orientation, and this is especially in this colloquium, for our discipline the communication has been for such a long time been desperate to be a discipline. We wanted our own journals and our own journal of communication and CR and our own impact factors. And I think a lot of the social sciences, political science included, has not answered the big questions. Do we need an EPA? What are which was created by Republicans and may now be dismantled by Republicans, right? What are the big environmental questions? What are the big sloppy, wicked problems that we need to tackle, and what are the solutions, rather than how can we actually, and ultimately the communication toward those, how do you communicate around core values that unite us as tribes, rather than, because there are clear arguments for the EPA on the conservative side. There are clear arguments on the liberal side. They tend to be slightly different. One of them focuses more on the environment part, the other one focuses more on maybe creation care, other parts, or communities and whatever else. But there are clearly values that cut across, and we haven't really done a good job. So that's number 1. And part of the reason, and this is where my somewhat intentionally snarky remarks about the discipline comes from, is that we do very little translational research around these problems. Right? I mean, if we submit an article and it has any practical implication, it has a good chance of getting rejected because it's not theory-driven enough. And as a result, we're publishing more and more research that is more and more incremental and less relevant in our discipline. I think we need to figure out how to answer questions in real time, which we also don't do. Right? We spend every election cycle and then afterwards figure out what went wrong and why we were wrong, which is, I mean, happened now in almost every election cycle. And then we write 4 years of research to then be wrong again, rather than actually figuring out ways in which we can contribute to discourses that are ongoing. And then the last one, of course, is I think it's also true for our students and for education, meaning we need to train people for jobs that don't exist yet because we still train people in journalism schools for a profession that's toast. That's just the way it is. So the question is, how do we prepare students for a world, and I put Google and DeepMind here. When they bought DeepMind, they immediately created an ethics board to basically say, we don't know why we need an ethics board, which is exactly why we need an ethics board. Because we have no clue what's going to come out of this stuff as far as AI and other things go. From a disciplinary perspective, this is insider kind of shop talk for communication, but you remember those effects models, right? When we talk about the history of our discipline, World War I, in the aftermath, the idea of magic bullets, strong effects. Everybody believed that what media do, they have a silver bullet, a magic bullet, a hypodermic needle effect. They enter our body and influence us. Very naive assumption about media effects. That was pretty quickly debunked by Lazarsfeld and others. Who said, no, not how it happens. In fact, it's really weak effect. It's only reinforcement. What happens is information goes to opinion leaders, they pass it on in a two-step flow, that's one. And then even if the information reaches it, it's just basically, if I'm a conservative, I'm going to selectively use that and it reinforces my conservative views, and liberals, and it reinforces my views. In the 70s, Nolan Neumann came along and said, hey, we need a return to the concept of powerful mass media, spiral of silence, George Gerbner at Penn. Nolan Neumann was my advisor, so full disclosure. And then we kind of went back to framing, priming, agenda setting. You'll hear about some of these things in the colloquium. Shanto Engar and I and Mike Cacciatore, who was a student here in the program, wrote a piece late last year, that we titled The End of Framing, so the end of this year, and basically called for a new model, and I think this is where we as a discipline really need to start thinking, which is what I would call preference-based effects models. Why are they right in the middle? They're neither strong nor weak. Because they're really strong because of tailored persuasion. They're really strong because I'm marketing toward you. Right? Whatever terabytes of data that you and your phone have produced, every location that you've ever been to, every store that you've ever checked in on, every Facebook like, every product that you've ever purchased, every credit card transaction that you've ever made, any airline that you've ever preferred over others, is one gigantic data set, which, by the way, there's legislation right now pending that the new House Republicans in 1718 Congress that will allow the government to collect these data, which in the past hasn't been possible. It was only allowed to buy these data, but not to collect them. So what does that mean? It means I can tailor information in exactly your vulnerable spots. That's what market targeting is all about. So hence, strong effects. But why weak effects? Because I basically can go out and discard everything that I don't want. If I have Feedly, Flipbook, any type of news aggregator, my Facebook feed will do another round of curation because it will take everything out that doesn't fit my social profile. This is why Google has been so absolutely desperate to have a social network, right? This is why they spent $1 billion on Waze, even though they already had a map thing, to get the social network. Why? Because they wanted to have social search. Meaning I feed you information that based on your social network, I know you will like. So a lot of what that I know about you, I know from your friends. So basically, this is me selecting from the individual end. So I weaken effects because I no longer watch Fox News if I'm a liberal. I can tune all of that out. It's no longer mass that everybody hears. It's individual, so it's weak, but it's also really strong because it's tailored so well. This is, I think, where our discipline is and where we have to go next. Last thing that I didn't put on here, read the Science of Science Communication report if you have a chance. It is the state of the art of what we know, and most importantly what we don't know, and pushing some of the next frontiers for science communication. And I actually shortened this talk in order to not go over, and I still went over.
And Simon.
And SciMap, which I didn't put on there, which is why I'm not getting criticized by my department chair. The Science, Media and the Public Research Group, which some of you are part of, and if you're not, you're more than welcome to sit in. So I'm going to leave it at that with exactly 2 minutes for discussion.
No,
Sorry.
I think we have 5 minutes.
Okay.
So hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you.